Hi guys, thanks for doing this with me. This is a little annoying way to do it, but it's better than nothing. I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to read the next 4 weeks really. We're going to be reading Dante's Inferno, which is the first part of 3 of the Divine Comedy. We will read about half of it the first 2 weeks and then the second half the next 2 weeks. I'm going to give you a little background on our poet, Dante Alighieri. He was an Italian living around, he was 1261 to 1321. So I think he wrote this right around the turn of the century, right around 1300. He is a contemporary, just a bit after Thomas Aquinas, who he was influenced by a lot. He's influenced a lot by Aristotle, which we talked a little bit about that last semester. The Inferno is Dante's journey through hell, and then he goes through purgatory and into paradise, and those are the 3 different parts of the poem. Dante himself was married. He had 4 children, but he loved another woman named Beatrice. And he didn't, he saw her when he was 9 years old, never married her, never acted on that in any way, but she became to him a sort of picture of heaven, of lots of things really, but a picture of the existence of God even. The experience of beauty and goodness. So she will actually become a major character in the end. We won't actually read about her in the Inferno, though she's implied everywhere. Dante was part of the political party that was in power in Florence in his day, but it was very tumultuous politically. So even though his party was the winning party, that party split and they were exiled. He was part of the party that wanted less papal authority over Florence, but he lived out the rest of his days in exile. He wrote this poem in exile. There's a lot of overlap in the poem about the city of God and the city of man and the influence of the church in the world, and you will see that come out a lot. You'll see a lot of references to Florence and to his contemporaries, which we won't get into a lot of that because we're not going to spend a lot of time in the history, but it is interesting and it's worth noting because you'll come across it quite a bit. And it's interesting to think about how, I think if you were writing a poem with people that you were meeting in hell being punished for their particular sins, if you were naming people that are currently in political power right now, that would not make people really happy. Which is another point to mention. This poem was not written in Latin. It was written in vernacular Italian because he wanted the common people to be able to read it. It's an epic, which we've talked about epics before. There are sort of 9 key components to an epic. It's a narrative story. It starts in medias res. It's in the middle. It starts in the middle. There's an appeal to the muses. There's an epic hero. There's a grand journey. There is some sort of interaction with divinities. There are universal themes that apply now and always and across cultures. There's some sort of epic catalog, and there's some sort of traditional verse or meter. Now in this one, you'll also have, kind of adding to that, Dante is unique when you put him next to the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, and that this story is redemptive. The other stories can end well. They don't all end well, but redemption is different than triumph, right? So in this one we have a uniquely Christian epic. We have a man who's lost at the beginning, making his way through understanding sin and repentance, and eventually being redeemed by love, by Christ. And that is why it's called the Divine Comedy. So, traditionally, comedy is used to kind of call a play or a poem when you would ridicule vice. But in this one, you take that even up another level, that it's also redemptive. It has a happy ending. Numbers are really important to Dante in his poem. Threes in particular. You'll see there are 9 levels of hell. There's sort of 3 different sections of 3 different circles of hell. There are 33 cantos in the 3 parts, in each part. Except for the first one, the one we read, there will be actually 34, which we see the first one then as a kind of prologue to the entire thing. It stands out out of the way of this normal pattern that he sets with 3s. So we'll spend a little time talking about that. And then he developed a rhyme scheme that is called Tirza Rima. It's very interesting. He wrote the poem in 3-line stanzas, and the rhyme scheme is this overlapping pattern. So it goes A, B, A, then the next stanza would be B, C, B, then the next stanza would be C, D, C. So they overlap with the stanza ahead, and it keeps going. This poem is also written as an allegory, and I want to spend a tiny bit of time talking about that. We use the term allegory kind of loosely nowadays. Allegory is really a particular style of writing. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is probably the most famous and the most easy to understand, because he actually names his symbols what he wants them to mean. So when you have Christian going into Vanity Fair, you understand that this Christian is fighting the sin of vanity, parts of his path, you know. But in Dante we have an allegory, but he gives us the images, but they're not so obvious. So that's going to take some work. You have these different characters, places that have an element in the story, and then they have an allegorical element. It's different. Sometimes we would say, we might say, Aslan is an allegory of Jesus, and Lewis was pretty strict about not wanting his books to be taken as allegories on the whole. Neither Tolkien felt the same way about like the Lord of the Rings, although we often see a sort of a loose definition of allegory, where we would say, oh, we can see the symbolism here, we can see how this reminds us of this. But that's not the same thing as a direct, someone purposefully saying, I am writing an allegory, and you should be looking for symbolic meaning in all of the characters and in all of the places, which is what we should be doing in Dante. So I'm just going to go over a few of the major images we have in Dante, the allegorical nature of them. So we have characters like Dante, Virgil, Beatrice, hell, purgatory, paradise. These are all kind of the major people and places in the poem. So in the story, Dante is actually himself. He's Dante. He's on this journey. He's kind of the epic hero. On the story level, that's who he is. On the allegory level, he represents the Christian pilgrim. He represents each one of us as individuals, and he represents groups of people, like we saw in Beowulf, where you have people groups and their sins collectively, and we should think like that. That's more of the medieval way of thinking. We should be careful not to read in too much of our modern individualism into some of these older things. They had a much more community-minded way of thinking. That's not to say they didn't also think individually, but we should think of Dante both as the person and as a Christian pilgrim. Virgil, who is Virgil from the poet of the Aeneid, and Dante loved him. He was his mentor, and his poetry inspired Dante to write, to learn. So in the story, Virgil is himself Virgil, but In the allegory, Virgil is to us a picture of common grace. He's um, kind of what every man can grasp in terms of beauty and art. Um, and he's sort of he can only take Dante so far, just like common grace can only take people so far. But it's still good. Then we have Beatrice, who I've mentioned earlier, Dante's love at first sight. She was a real woman that he really saw. I think she died young. And where Virgil has to stop, Beatrice picks up. She represents, in the allegory, special grace. So she represents sort of the divine love to lead Dante in through paradise. We get to the places then, the three major places, which are the names of the three parts. Hell is hell in the story, but is also, in the allegory, meant to show the deepening evils of the soul. It's teaching Dante to hate sin, to see the justice of God over sin. And I think you'll start to get that as you read. Pay close attention to that. That's something we're going to pay attention to, is think about the order that Dante arranges these sins and the consequences that come with them. That's both in the story clear, but also the way that you'll see this inverted funnel of hell where it just regresses. Sin, it spreads, but sin makes us smaller, and how you see it tighten. Purgatory, which is a Catholic idea, and so it's interesting for us Protestants to read it, but I think we still benefit a lot from it, because really, in the story, purgatory is purgatory, and there's a lot of, theologically wrong with it that we would disagree with, but we can still learn a lot, and I think we kind of get this idea of repentance and sanctification of the Christian life for the living, what that looks like to hate sin, to put off sin. And then finally the poem ends in paradise, and paradise is paradise, but in the allegory it's still, even for us now, before we're actually there, the state of grace, or longing for heaven, enjoying our salvation even now. So this poem, it's going on a man through this journey all the way through hell. It actually, I'll go back to that, all the way through hell, up Mount Purgatory, into paradise. And it's for the living. So even though it's taking a man through these things, when you think about death, all these are states of, after death in actuality, but in the allegory, we're to learn something as living people from it. So keep that in mind too.